Everyone expected a routine royal gathering, until Princess Anne made a private request that sent shivers through palace corridors. With Queen Camilla hosting the annual diplomatic ballroom gala, Anne's sudden insistence to give a speech raised quiet alarms. But why now? And why this event? What no one knew was that Anne had uncovered something deeply personal and deeply political. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. In the hushed corridors of Buckingham, where formality and silence serve as currency, a royal aide delivered a handwritten note directly to the event organizers, its sender, Princess Anne. Its contents? A formal request to address the assembled dignitaries at the conclusion of the gala. What initially seemed like a courteous gesture soon grew teeth. There was a shift in the air. Those close to palace operations noted a new tone in Anne's approach, more pointed, more urgent, less bound by rehearsed tradition. Some even claimed the phrasing of her letter held traces of veiled confrontation. Behind those guarded words, insiders believed Anne was preparing to break a silence the crown had long maintained. Camilla, when first informed, appeared unfazed. She nodded with the grace expected of a queen consort, offering verbal approval. But that night, behind the heavy curtains of the blue drawing room, her unease reportedly surfaced. According to multiple sources, Camilla made subtle inquiries. Who had approved this speech? Was it sanctioned by the council? Why had Anne never mentioned this before? To some, it looked like a queen being caught off guard. To others, it felt like something deeper, an attempt to control the narrative before Anne seized it. Then came the murmurs. In palace circles, silence speaks louder than gossip, but this time both moved in tandem. Royal aides speculated whether Anne's speech would address the growing discomfort within the family, a discomfort not aired publicly, but deeply felt in private. The carefully curated unity of the monarchy had been tested in recent months. Political pressures, internal power shifts, and a quiet but mounting friction between the elder and newer branches of the royal structure. Some believed Anne's speech might expose these rifts under the guise of remembrance. Others suspected something more direct. Adding to the growing tension, Prince William was spotted leaving Anne's private wing late the evening before the gala. No aides were present. No itinerary entry explained the meeting. Whatever passed between them remained confidential, but observers couldn't ignore the implications. If William was aligning himself with Anne in this moment, it meant a generational pivot could be underway. One source close to the royal household said simply, "If William is backing her, then this isn't just a speech, it's a declaration." And then there was the notebook. The small velvet-bound journal Anne had been seen clutching with increasing frequency. Few had seen its contents, but whispers suggested it contained handwritten notes from Queen Elizabeth herself, unpublished, possibly unfinished, and laden with significance. The notion that Anne might read from it in front of foreign ambassadors and British dignitaries was more than controversial, it was explosive. The late Queen's words still carried an unshakable weight, and if they were to be spoken, the ripple effect across the monarchy would be seismic. But the tension that simmered in private was about to erupt in public because, on the night of the gala, Camilla made her move. The chandeliers gleamed, the orchestra swelled. But behind the regal splendor of the gala, a quiet plan was in motion. Camilla, fearing what Anne might reveal, had already set the wheels of interference in motion. Microphone arrangements were adjusted, the speaking order was revised, and the program mysteriously omitted Anne's name altogether. As the grand ballroom filled with dignitaries, nobles, and political figures, few noticed the subtle shift in the evening's agenda. But those within the royal inner circle could feel it, a tightening of the schedule, a rearrangement too precise to be accidental. It began with the printed program, once circulated confidently among the guests. Anne's name, once confirmed for the closing remarks, was now missing. In its place, an ambiguous note, closing address by Her Majesty the Queen Consort. The implication was unmistakable. Anne had been removed without public explanation. Camilla's staff, discreet but deliberate, delivered quiet. Instructions to the technical team, dim the lights earlier, cue the orchestra sooner, and above all, end the night promptly after Camilla's speech. When questioned, they offered only rehearsed shrugs. A minor adjustment, one aide insisted. But those who had witnessed the week's tension knew better. This was not a scheduling conflict, it was a blockade. Prince William noticed immediately. Aides say he studied the program with an expression of careful calculation. When approached by a senior protocol officer who asked whether Anne would be speaking, William simply said, "Let's see how the night unfolds." It was neither confirmation nor denial, but those who heard it knew it carried weight. His silence was not indifference. It was warning. The atmosphere, once festive, now simmered with quiet suspicion. Pockets of guests exchanged whispers as the realization spread. Anne's speech had vanished. Was it cancelled? Did she withdraw? Was it silenced? The murmurs began to grow louder, enough to reach Catherine's table, where even Princess Charlotte's face reportedly twisted into a frown. She leaned into her mother, confused. Catherine, ever composed, placed a calm hand over her daughter's, though her eyes remained fixed on Camilla. And then, in a conversation not meant for public ears, Camilla leaned toward a foreign diplomat, and, with a tight smile, reportedly said, "Anne won't be closing the evening after all. It's best we keep the mood light." It was said with effortless grace, but the message underneath was cutting. She had acted, she had taken control, and she believed in that moment the situation was contained. But control in the royal family is never absolute. And silencing a princess known for her iron will was never going to be as simple as an erased name or a shortened agenda. Anne wasn't merely a senior royal. She was a daughter of the late Queen, a woman forged in duty and discipline, and one who had never bowed easily to political maneuvering. She had come to speak, and her decision to do so wasn't a whim, it was a mission. But what Camilla hadn't counted on was Anne's resolve, and the next few minutes would redefine their relationship forever. She wasn't called the Steel of the Crown for nothing. As Camilla concluded her remarks and the orchestra began to play, Anne, without waiting for protocol, rose from her seat and walked to the podium. Every head turned. The music stumbled. Camilla's face blanched. And then, in a voice steadier than anyone expected, Anne began to speak. There was no announcement, no formal cue, just a royal presence stepping into a void that should never have existed. The moment Anne stood, time itself seemed to fracture. The orchestra, mid-crescendo, faltered and fell silent. Several aides, unsure whether to follow Camilla's unspoken orders or uphold the chain of deference to a senior royal, hesitated in limbo. For a heartbeat, the monarchy seemed unsure of itself. Anne seized that very hesitation and turned it into authority. She walked with purpose, not arrogance, not defiance, but with the full weight of generations behind her. And when she reached the microphone, there was no question who now held the room. William didn't move to stop her. He didn't signal concern. He didn't glance toward Camilla or her staff for permission. Instead, he met Anne's gaze across the ballroom and gave a single nod. It was OT just support, it was sanction. From the future king to the unyielding princess, the message was clear, speak. In that nod, history pivoted. Camilla froze. Clutching her champagne glass tightly, her hand visibly trembled. Her colour drained not just from surprise, but from a realization far deeper she had lost control. The very moment she thought she had boxed Anne out of the ceremony, Anne had reclaimed the evening through sheer resolve. The Queen Consort had tried to silence a voice that would not be silenced, and now that voice echoed over a breathless crowd. Anne's first words weren't accusations or rebukes, they were memory. She opened with a story, personal and poignant, about a moment shared with Queen Elizabeth not long before her passing. A handwritten letter, a private exchange, a final confession between mother and daughter that had never before been spoken aloud. She said, Anne began, her voice rich with restrained emotion, that there would come a time when silence would threaten the very soul of the crown. And if that time ever came, someone would need to speak, regardless of the cost. The room fell into a reverent hush. What followed wasn't a tirade, it was a reckoning. Anne spoke of legacy, not just in name or tradition, but in duty. She spoke of sacrifices made and truths buried. She did not name Camilla, but the absence of that name only sharpened the implication. Her every word was a mirror held up to the room, reflecting not just the failures of protocol, but the betrayal of purpose. This wasn't just about a speech. It was about the soul of the monarchy, and the audience felt it. From dignitaries to distant cousins, from veteran courtiers to First Tim, guests. There was an awakening in the air. Eyes that had once politely glazed over at ceremonial pleasantries were now locked in, many glistening with tears. Anne had not raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her truth had weight enough to flatten every pretense in that gilded room, but as Anne's words gained momentum, Camilla's panic shifted into something darker, and what she did next would ignite a royal explosion. With each passing sentence, Anne's message grew bolder. Camilla couldn't take it. In a stunning break from royal decorum, she stood interrupting the speech with a single phrase that echoed through the room like a shot. "This is not appropriate." Gasps followed. Staff froze. Even seasoned royals looked away. What followed was not just a power play, it was a war of legacy. The weight of the room shifted in an instant. Camilla's voice, sharp and deliberate, pierced through Anne's measured words, like a blade drawn across an heirloom tapestry. There had been breaches of protocol in the past, awkward moments, hesitant speeches, but never before had a queen consort risen mid-address to directly challenge a senior royal in front of foreign dignitaries and internal power players. The words she chose "this was not cleared with me" or "the council" weren't just a correction. They were an indictment, and in that moment every guest knew they were witnessing more than a disagreement. They were watching the monarchy fracture in real time. The air grew tight with disbelief. Camilla's statement had thrown everything into disarray. The staff, who had been nervously scanning the gala from the edges of the room, suddenly stiffened. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence that followed was not the respectful pause of a royal gathering. It was the stunned paralysis of a court unsure which queen to follow. The split in power, once whispered in corridors and hinted at in headlines, now stood exposed for all to see. Camilla's composure had shattered, and Anne's response would define everything that followed. Anne did not flinch. She did not turn away or step back from the podium. Instead, she paused just long enough to let Camilla's interruption hang in the air, exposed and raw. Then, with a gaze sharp enough to silence an entire hall, she looked directly at her sister-in-law. It was not a glare of contempt, but of clarity of iron conviction. And though her lips didn't move for several seconds, her silence said everything. This was no longer about approval, this was about truth. At that very moment, Sophie and Catherine exchanged glances that were anything but casual. For those familiar with the subtle language of palace politics, the look between them carried the weight of allegiance. They understood the stakes. Camilla's outburst had crossed a line, one that even she couldn't redraw. The institution was watching. The family was watching, and the public inevitably would follow. Catherine's jaw tightened. Sophie's eyes narrowed. It wasn't spoken, but it was felt. Anne was not standing alone. What had begun as a carefully choreographed evening of regal optics had now veered into scandal. The ballroom, once echoing with polite applause and soft laughter, now simmered with barely contained shock. Diplomats whispered across tables. Advisors exchanged furtive looks. A few guests clutched their programs, as if trying to confirm that this chaos wasn't part of the schedule. Camilla, once the picture of controlled elegance, now stood exposed, accused not by words but by her own unravelling. And then, just when it seemed like a royal breakdown was unfolding live, Prince William stepped forward. The future king walked toward the podium. No warning, no permission. William's voice rang out, not just as a son or a prince, but as a man who had finally seen enough. What he said next didn't just silence the room. It stunned his aunt. It humiliated the Queen. And it exposed something the royal family had buried for years. The shock of Camilla's outburst still lingered in the air when William moved. Calm, deliberate, unstoppable. He didn't hesitate, didn't wait for approval from any aide or protocol officer. The heir apparent walked straight into the storm and stood beside Anne, placing himself between the chaos and the truth. The ballroom, already teetering on the edge of disbelief, now stood still as death. And then, In a voice that carried no anger but all authority, he said 3 words that detonated like thunder across the royal hall. Let her speak. That was all, but it changed everything. Camilla's reaction was instant. She took a step forward, visibly rattled, attempting to assert herself again. "William," she began, the warning tone in her voice unmistakable. But before she could say more, he raised a hand, not in disrespect, but in finality. It was a gesture that didn't require force. It carried the full weight of succession, the full weight of his bloodline. His calm overpowered her presence in a way no speech ever could. He didn't shout, he didn't plead, he simply ended the discussion. Then came the truth, with the entire room. Holding its breath, William addressed the unspoken. Before his condition worsened, he began. "My father personally approved this speech. He wanted it delivered, by her, in his name." The stunned gasp that followed wasn't just from guests, it came from the very heart of the institution. In one stroke, William had not only exposed Camilla's sabotage, he had stripped it of all legitimacy. This wasn't a rogue speech, it was a royal directive. And then, almost reverently, he motioned toward the velvet notebook still in Anne's hands. "This," he said, "is the final letter my grandmother gave to Anne in private. It was never published, it was never meant to be hidden. She wanted it spoken aloud tonight." His voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the echo of a promise. "My grandmother asked for this moment. No one else has the right to stop it." And in that instant, the royal family's carefully constructed walls began to collapse. Some in the crowd had tears in their eyes before the first word of the letter was even read. Others clapped not in celebration but in reverence. A hush followed, the kind only born from irreversible moments. Even those who had come simply for diplomacy or ceremony now realized they were witnessing a seismic shift in the monarchy's soul. William hadn't just defended Anne, he had defended legacy. He had reclaimed something sacred from behind closed doors and given it back to the people right where it belonged. But the revelations didn't stop there, because what Anne read next would destroy every illusion of unity. As Anne opened the notebook, a gasp echoed from behind the pillars. It wasn't just a letter, it was a direct challenge from the late Queen to the current order. In her own hand, Elizabeth had written warnings, reflections, and a damning reference to Camilla's influence. The room held its collective breath as Anne turned the first page, her voice quiet but unwavering. "My fear is not for the throne, but for the integrity of those who may one day claim its shadow without understanding its burden." The words, penned in Queen Elizabeth's unmistakable script, hit like a lightning bolt. No one had expected this, not even those who had guessed Anne's speech would be controversial. The late Queen's letter was not a gentle passing of the torch. It was a coded, deliberate directive, written with clarity and courage. And as Anne read on, the implications began to cut deeper than anyone could have prepared for. She continued, slowly revealing the Queen's private concerns over a future shaped by influence rather than example, and her regret that certain appointments had moved the crown from its compass. The phrases were subtle but loaded. The reference to future misguidance had been thought to be political, but Anne now made it personal. When she paused at the line, "A crown worn without weight is a danger to the realm," the air turned electric. That one sentence was all it took to shatter the illusion of unity. Audible murmurs rippled through the hall, and Camilla, for the first time that evening, looked visibly shaken. Her smile, always ready for ceremonial comfort, vanished. Her posture sank. Her gaze dropped to the floor. Anne did not look at her. She didn't have to. The entire room had already made the connection. The Queen's words, preserved and hidden for so long, had now come back like a silent sword, unseen, but devastating. This was not an accusation from Anne. It was a message from the matriarch herself, long gone but now roaring back with the force of finality. There was no room left for denial. The subtext had become scripture. Anne shifted slightly, her voice trembling now not with fear, but with the crushing weight of truth. She asked that this letter remain unread until the day silence became more dangerous than scandal. Then, after a long pause, she added, "That day is today. Her words landed like a bell toll, final and echoing. Even the most hardened royals, Andrew, Edward, who had seen the palace through wars of tradition and waves of scandal, remained silent. Not a breath of objection passed their lips. Some stared forward in stunned stillness. Others lowered their heads, absorbing the shock. This wasn't a family argument. It was a royal reckoning. Anne wasn't undermining Camilla. She was upholding the wishes of a monarch whose legacy had been increasingly blurred. There was no malice in her tone, only duty. But in this palace, truth, especially truth wrapped in ink from Elizabeth's own hand, was more powerful than title, lineage, or position. The fault lines that had been hidden beneath decades of ceremonial smiles were now exposed for all to see. The entire monarchy now stood on fragile ground, but what William announced next would shift the palace forever. With eyes locked on his family, William stepped forward once more. What began as an interruption now became a declaration. In full view of the diplomatic elite, the heir to the throne introduced a historic protocol, one that would quietly transfer ceremonial authority away from Camilla, effective immediately. There was no hesitation in his voice, no softness left in his delivery. William, who for years had played the balancing act between generations, no longer held back. The truth had been read aloud. The crown's silence had been shattered, and now action was required. Protocol Glenmore, he began, is not a decision made in haste. It was signed, sealed, and sanctioned in the final weeks of clarity from His Majesty before his retreat from public affairs. Gasps echoed before he could continue. In just one sentence, William had rendered moot any further resistance. Camilla may have occupied the stage, but it was now Anne who would carry the crown's ceremonial spirit forward. Quietly, irrevocably, the axis shifted. Protocol Glenmore, as William explained, was a confidential succession measure crafted by King Charles himself when his condition began to deteriorate. Designed as a contingency, it restructured the delegation of symbolic and state ceremonial duties to safeguard the monarchy's stability. Anne, who had remained unshakably loyal, would now preside over ceremonial functions. Catherine and Edward, two of the most publicly trusted senior royals, would reinforce the structure. Together, the three would form a trinity of stewardship under the king's shadow, stabilizing public confidence while the palace adjusted behind closed doors. William was careful. He did not strip Camilla of her title. There was no dethronement, no direct condemnation, but the implications were unmistakable. Her role, once administrative, would now be solely honorary. She would represent the crown only in name, no longer in operation. The move was as strategic as it was symbolic, a surgical reassignment of power, cloaked in civility. It protected the monarchy's image while draining her influence, and Camilla knew it. As William spoke, she remained motionless. Her silence now thundered louder than any argument she could offer. Several members of the royal family turned toward her, but she gave no response. For the first time that evening, the Queen Consort appeared not as a figure of authority, but as a relic of a rapidly closing chapter. Then came a moment that no one had anticipated. Anne looked to William not for confirmation, but with a glance of mutual understanding. Catherine, seated beside Charlotte, gave the faintest nod. Edward, ever the quiet anchor of duty, rose in affirmation. It was subtle, unplanned, but unified, and as the implication sank in, a wave of guests slowly stood, first diplomats, then parliamentarians, then even international observers. A cautious standing ovation emerged. Not for disruption, not for spectacle, but for truth, for restoration, for the echo of a queen's wishes finally honoured. Camilla did not stand. Her chair remained pulled slightly back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She watched as the room applauded not her, but the very shift that hollowed out her role. She did not speak, and she did not rise, because even she understood some silences are admissions. But even as power shifted, there was still one final act that no one could have predicted. With dignity intact, Anne returned to the microphone. Her voice cracked only once, but her message was unshakable. In just a few minutes, she had reignited a spirit that had nearly vanished from the crown. But it was her final line that left the ballroom breathless. A line not meant as a threat, but as a warning. Anne stood taller now, no longer fighting for space or permission. She was no longer responding to conflict, she was concluding it. With the velvet notebook gently closed beneath her hand, she gave the room one last look. What had begun as a defiant stand had become something larger, something timeless. "My mother," she said softly, "believed that the strength of the monarchy would never be measured in gold or titles, but the quiet endurance of its unseen guardians." The room froze, hearing the shift in tone. Those who uphold truth without demanding crowns. They are the ones who carry its soul. It wasn't just a tribute, it was a judgment. She didn't name names. She didn't need to. Her voice, still composed despite everything, carved through the air like a hymn wrapped in steel. And when she warned that the monarchy's downfall would never come from outside forces, but from within, from those who misuse royal memory for personal legacy, the silence turned into unease. Some understood instantly that the message was aimed at Camilla. Others wondered who else it might reach. But all felt the shadow of reckoning descend on that hall. Amid the silence, only movement betrayed shifting tides. Catherine and William exchanged a glance, brief, wordless, powerful. There was no joy in it, no gloating, only resolve. Whatever had begun that evening wasn't finished. It had only revealed itself. Their look hinted at something deeper waiting in the wings, an understanding that restoring order meant more than a protocol or a speech. It meant confronting what had been hidden for too long. The foundations had shifted, and they were prepared to carry the next weight of that burden. And then, almost unnoticed, Camilla rose from her chair. There was no outburst, no dramatic gesture, just a quiet retreat. She walked toward the exit before the applause, before the final words, before the crown could make peace with itself. Some thought it was dignified, others thought it was defeat. But all agreed it was telling. For a queen to walk out before the end of a royal reckoning was not just symbolic, it was seismic. The applause came slowly, not as a roar of celebration, but a respectful rise of gratitude. People stood not just for Anne, but for the truth she had carried into the open. No fanfare, no closing music, no final toast, just a ripple of clapping hands in a room that felt changed, cleansed by confession, yet heavier with consequence. And as Anne prepared to leave the podium, her final line echoed one that guests would repeat in interviews, whisper about in corridors, and remember long after the lights dimmed. "History always returns," she said, her voice unwavering, "whether we're ready for it or not." But even after the applause faded, whispers continued, and one secret envelope remained unopened on Charles's desk. As the palace settled into silence after the night's drama, a single envelope remained sealed. It bore the king's crest and only one name, Princess Anne. Sources suggest Charles, in his final lucid moments, wrote a letter meant to be opened only after a formal fracture. What lay inside could either mend the family or finally expose its deepest fractures. It was discovered early the next morning by a royal aide assigned to Charles's private study, an area that had remained cordoned off during the gala's preparations. The envelope, resting beneath a marble paperweight, had not been hidden, but deliberately placed where it would be found only by someone trusted. Its label read simply, for Clarion Protocol Review, "Eyes Only." The handwriting was unmistakably the king's, and the recipient, equally unmistakable, Princess Anne. No one else's name appeared on the seal. No co-signatories, no copies. It was a solitary instruction from the monarch to the only sibling who had just walked through, fire to defend the crown's soul. What makes the timing more chilling is that insiders now believe Charles had anticipated the fracture long before the public ever sensed it. His health had declined quickly, but not so swiftly as to rob him of foresight. The letter reportedly includes a final reinforcement of a little-known legacy clause buried deep within Queen Elizabeth's Codicil I, granting Anne specific ceremonial jurisdiction in the event of a contested transition. According to a high-level source close to the council secretariat, the clause had never been activated. Until now, the contents of the letter remain officially undisclosed. But leaks suggest that beyond affirming Anne's elevated role, the message also outlines sweeping recommendations for archival access protocol reform and the declassification of private correspondences between past monarchs. These directives, if implemented, would fundamentally alter the gatekeeping of royal legacy. And yet, not a single mention of Camilla appears within the text. The absence speaks volumes. In royal circles, silence is rarely neutral. Here, it reads as a deliberate omission, a final, devastating sidelining of the queen consort from the monarchy's strategic future. As word of the envelope's existence spread within the palace, whispers intensified. Council aides began quietly preparing for what was supposed to be a routine Council of State meeting in the coming week. But now, no one expects business as usual. There is talk of confrontation, of realignment, of new oaths and older truths. William, still riding the momentum of his unprecedented public stand, is said to be in close contact with Anne daily. Catherine remains visibly composed but unusually secluded. Even Edward, often the silent stabilizer, has reportedly requested access to certain protected documents ahead of the meeting, an uncharacteristic move, suggesting deeper alignment behind the scenes. Whatever this letter contains, one truth is now beyond dispute. Charles did not abdicate his judgment in his final days. He directed it, and he left the weight of that direction in Anne's hands, not Camilla's. It is a haunting final move from a monarch who once promised continuity but ended his reign in quiet disruption. The family may still smile on balconies, but behind closed doors, tectonic shifts are already underway. The ballroom may be empty, but the war for the soul of the monarchy has only just begun. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.